In a small village, a cat named Whiskers discovered a magic fish in a pond. The fish promised 3 wishes in exchange for its freedom. Whiskers wished for endless fish, a cozy bed, and a bell that rang softly. The fish granted all 3 wishes and swam away. The old Winchester rifle hung on the wall like a forgotten memory. Dust had settled into every groove of its wooden stock, and the metal barrel had lost its shine years ago. Most people who visited Earl Thompson's gun shop barely gave it a second glance. They were drawn to the modern firearms with their sleek designs and advanced technology. The Winchester looked ancient compared to the high-tech weapons surrounding it. Earl had inherited the rifle from his grandfather, along with the gun shop on Main Street. His grandfather used to tell stories about that Winchester, claiming it was the most accurate rifle he'd ever owned. But those were just old man's tales, Earl thought. The rifle was probably made sometime in the 1940s, and technology had come a long way since then. Modern rifles had better sights, improved barrels, and precision engineering that the old Winchester could never match. The local shooting club met every Saturday at the range just outside town. Earl was a regular member, though he wasn't particularly skilled. He usually brought his modern hunting rifle, the same one most other members used. They would spend hours trying to hit targets at various distances, comparing their expensive scopes and discussing the latest ammunition types. Earl enjoyed the camaraderie, even if his shooting scores were consistently average. One Saturday morning, Earl's regular rifle developed a problem with its scope. The mounting had come loose and he couldn't get it properly aligned. He was about to cancel his range session when his eyes fell on the old Winchester. On impulse, he decided to bring it along. Maybe it would be interesting to see how the old gun performed, even if just for curiosity's sake. When Earl arrived at the range with the Winchester, the other members noticed immediately. The rifle looked completely out of place among their modern equipment. Some of them chuckled, thinking Earl was making some kind of joke. Others examined it with the kind of interest usually reserved for museum exhibits. The wooden stock was worn smooth from decades of handling, and the iron sights looked primitive compared to their high-powered scopes. Mike Patterson, the club's best marksman, picked up the Winchester and hefted it in his hands. He shook his head with a knowing smile. Mike owned several $1,000s worth of precision rifles and had won numerous competitions. He looked at Earl with amusement and said the old gun belonged in a museum, not on a shooting range. The comment drew laughter from the other members who agreed that modern technology had made such rifles obsolete. Earl felt a bit embarrassed but decided to proceed anyway. He had driven all the way to the range and he was curious about his grandfather's stories. The other members continued setting up their equipment, adjusting their scopes and preparing their carefully selected ammunition. Earl loaded the Winchester with basic hunting rounds he had bought years ago for his regular rifle. The ammunition wasn't even specifically matched to the old Winchester's specifications. The first target was set at 100 yards, a standard distance for the club's weekly practice. Earl stepped up to the firing line, feeling self-conscious about the antique rifle in his hands. The other members had finished their preparations and were watching him with amused interest. Some had their phones ready, probably expecting to record what they assumed would be an embarrassing display of the old rifle's limitations. Earl raised the Winchester to his shoulder. The wooden stock felt different from his modern rifle, somehow more solid and comfortable. The iron sights were basic compared to the sophisticated scopes he was used to, but they seemed to line up naturally. He took a deep breath, aimed at the center of the target, and squeezed the trigger. The rifle fired with a sharp crack that echoed across the range. When the target was checked, everyone fell silent. The bullet had struck dead center, creating a perfect bullseye. The other members looked at each other in surprise, then back at Earl and his old Winchester. Mike Patterson raised his eyebrows and suggested it was probably just beginner's luck. Earl himself was surprised by the result, but he was beginning to understand why his grandfather had spoken so fondly of this particular rifle. Ving Whiskers content and purring in the sun. The second shot was just as precise as the first. Earl lined up the iron sights again, steadied his breathing, and fired. Another perfect bullseye appeared on the target, right next to the first hole. The cluster was so tight that the 2 holes nearly overlapped. The murmurs among the club members grew louder. What they had dismissed as luck was starting to look like something more significant. Mike Patterson stepped forward with his own rifle, a custom-built precision weapon worth more than most people's cars. He had spent months fine-tuning every component, from the barrel to the trigger mechanism. His scope alone cost more than Earl's entire gun collection. Mike was determined to show everyone that modern technology still reigned supreme over outdated equipment. Mike's first shot was excellent by normal standards, landing within the inner ring of the target. His second shot was equally good, creating a respectable grouping. But when compared to Earl's tight cluster of bullseyes, Mike's shooting suddenly seemed ordinary. The other members noticed the difference immediately. They began whispering among themselves, comparing the two targets with growing amazement. Earl continued shooting, and the pattern remained consistent. Every shot found the center of the target with mechanical precision. The old Winchester seemed to have a mind of its own, delivering accuracy that defied logic. Earl's confidence grew with each shot, and he began to feel a connection to the rifle that he had never experienced with his modern equipment. The weapon felt like an extension of his own body. Word of Earl's remarkable shooting began to spread around the range. Members from other shooting stations stopped their own practice to watch the man with the antique rifle. They gathered behind the firing line, pointing at the target and shaking their heads in disbelief. Some took pictures of the target, knowing their friends wouldn't believe the story without photographic evidence. Dr. Sarah Chen, a retired military officer and competitive shooter, examined the Winchester with professional interest. She had seen thousands of rifles during her career and knew quality when she saw it. After inspecting the weapon carefully, she announced that it was indeed an exceptional firearm, probably hand-fitted by a master craftsman decades ago. The rifle's reputation as a museum piece was completely undeserved. The club president, Robert Walsh, decided to make things more challenging. He moved the targets back to 200 yards, double the original distance. At this range, even experienced shooters with modern equipment often struggled to maintain tight groupings. The wind conditions were less favorable too, with a slight crosswind that would test any rifle's accuracy and the shooter's skill. Earl felt nervous about the increased distance, but the Winchester continued to perform flawlessly. His first shot at 200 yards struck the bullseye with the same precision he had shown at closer range. The second shot created another perfect hole right next to it. The crowd of onlookers grew larger as word spread throughout the entire shooting facility about the incredible display of accuracy. Mike Patterson was becoming increasingly frustrated. He had always been the star performer at the club, and his reputation was built on his shooting prowess. He fired several more rounds with his expensive rifle, trying to match Earl's performance. While his shots were good, they couldn't compare to the consistent perfection coming from the old Winchester. His groupings were respectable but clearly inferior. Other members began trying to explain what they were witnessing. Some suggested that Earl was a secret professional marksman who had been hiding his skills. Others theorized that the old ammunition was somehow perfectly matched to the rifle's characteristics. A few insisted that the rifle itself was some kind of special military prototype that had been disguised as an ordinary hunting weapon. Earl knew the truth was simpler than any of these theories. The Winchester was exactly what it appeared to be, an old hunting rifle made by skilled craftsmen who took pride in their work. His grandfather hadn't been telling tall tales after all. The rifle's accuracy was genuine, and Earl was simply the person fortunate enough to rediscover its remarkable capabilities. The shooting session continued for another hour, with Earl firing round after round with the same incredible results. Every shot found its mark with precision that seemed almost supernatural. The target looked like it had been repeatedly struck by a machine designed for perfect accuracy. The crowd of spectators continued to grow, and even shooters from neighboring ranges came over to witness the extraordinary display. News of Earl's remarkable shooting spread beyond the local range within days. Social media posts showing his perfect target groups went viral in shooting communities across the country. Videos of the old Winchester in action were shared thousands of times, with comments ranging from amazement to skepticism. Many viewers insisted the footage had to be fake, claiming no antique rifle could outperform modern precision weapons. A regional shooting competition was scheduled for the following month, and the organizers personally invited Earl to participate. The event attracted some of the best marksmen in the state, people who had invested tens of thousands of dollars in their equipment and spent years perfecting their techniques. Earl initially hesitated, feeling intimidated by the level of competition he would be facing. The competition announcement specifically mentioned Earl and his vintage Winchester, describing them as a special attraction that participants shouldn't miss. This created even more pressure, as competitors began researching Earl's background, trying to discover his secret training or professional shooting experience. They found nothing except records of his average performance at local club events using his regular rifle. Earl spent the weeks leading up to the competition practicing with the Winchester every day. He discovered that the rifle's accuracy wasn't limited to specific conditions or ammunition types. Whether he used cheap hunting rounds or expensive match-grade bullets, the results remained consistently perfect. The rifle seemed to compensate for variables that would affect other weapons, maintaining its precision regardless of external factors. The competition day arrived with clear skies and minimal wind, perfect conditions for long-range shooting. Earl arrived at the venue carrying the Winchester in an old leather case that had belonged to his grandfather. The contrast between his humble equipment and the high-tech gear of other competitors was striking. Some participants had rifle cases worth more than Earl's truck. Registration took place in a large tent where competitors displayed their weapons for inspection and measurement. Earl's Winchester drew immediate attention from officials and competitors alike. A firearms expert examined it carefully, confirming that it was completely legal and unmodified. The rifle was exactly as it had been manufactured decades ago, with no modern upgrades or performance enhancements. The first stage of the competition involved shooting at targets placed 300 yards away, significantly farther than the club range where Earl had been practicing. Many competitors expressed confidence that this distance would expose the limitations of the old Winchester. Modern rifles with advanced optics and specialized ammunition were designed for precisely this type of long-range precision work. Earl felt nervous as he prepared for his first competitive shot. The Winchester had never failed him, but the pressure was unlike anything he had experienced before. Cameras were recording every moment and dozens of expert marksmen were watching his every move. The weight of expectations from people who had traveled specifically to see him perform was almost overwhelming. The first shot rang out across the range, and Earl waited anxiously for the spotting scope to reveal where his bullet had struck. The range officer's voice came over the loudspeaker, announcing a perfect center hit. The crowd of spectators erupted in applause, and several competitors shook their heads in amazement. Earl felt a wave of relief wash over him as he realized the Winchester's magic hadn't abandoned him. Shot after shot, the pattern continued. Earl's targets showed groupings so tight, they appeared to have been created by a precision machine rather than a human shooter. Competitors using rifles costing 10 times as much as Earl's Winchester struggled to match even half of his accuracy. The scoreboard showed Earl taking a commanding lead that seemed impossible to overcome. Mike Patterson had entered the same competition, bringing his most expensive rifle and premium ammunition. He had been practicing intensively since the day at the club range, determined to prove that modern technology could triumph over Earl's antique weapon. However, his shots, while excellent by normal standards, looked ordinary when compared to Earl's consistent perfection. Media representatives began interviewing Earl between shooting stages, asking about his background and training methods. Earl honestly explained that he had no special training and had only recently discovered the Winchester's capabilities. His simple answers frustrated reporters, who expected stories about secret techniques or hidden expertise that would explain his extraordinary performance. The competition officials started implementing additional challenges specifically for Earl, moving targets to even greater distances and introducing time limits designed to pressure him into making mistakes. Each new obstacle was met with the same flawless accuracy from the old Winchester. Earl began to feel like he was shooting in a bubble where normal limitations didn't apply to him and his grandfather's rifle. The final stage of the competition required shooters to engage targets at 500 yards, a distance that separated true marksmen from casual enthusiasts. The targets appeared impossibly small through the spotting scopes, and even the most experienced competitors acknowledged this would be a significant challenge. Wind conditions had picked up throughout the day, adding another variable that could affect bullet trajectory. Earl approached the firing line with the Winchester, feeling the familiar weight of the rifle in his hands. The weapon had become like an old friend, responding to his touch with predictable precision. He had stopped questioning why the rifle performed so well, and simply accepted it as a gift from his grandfather, who had somehow known this day would come. The first shot at 500 yards sailed through the air for what seemed like an eternity before striking the target. The spotting scope revealed another perfect center hit, drawing gasps from the assembled crowd. Competitors who had been confident about their chances at the extended range suddenly realized they were witnessing something truly extraordinary. The Winchester was defying every expectation about antique firearms. Professional shooting instructors in the audience began studying Earl's technique, hoping to identify the secret behind his success. They watched his stance, breathing pattern, and trigger control with scientific intensity. However, Earl's form was textbook basic, nothing that couldn't be learned from any standard shooting manual. The magic clearly resided in the rifle itself, not in any special technique. Television crews arrived to document the unprecedented event of an antique rifle dominating a modern precision shooting competition. The story had all the elements that made for compelling viewing. An underdog with humble equipment defeating highly skilled competitors using the latest technology. Earl found himself thrust into a spotlight he had never sought or desired. Between shooting stages, firearms historians approached Earl with theories about his Winchester's origins. Some believed it might have been a special presentation rifle given to his grandfather for military service. Others suggested it could be a prototype that had received extra attention from the factory's master craftsman. Earl listened politely but knew the truth was probably much simpler. The competition's final round required each shooter to fire 10 shots in rapid succession, testing their ability to maintain accuracy under time pressure. This format typically favored competitors with extensive training and expensive equipment designed for quick target acquisition. Earl had never attempted rapid-fire precision shooting and worried this might finally expose the Winchester's limitations. The timer started, and Earl began firing as quickly as he could while maintaining proper sight alignment. The Winchester cycled smoothly, ejecting spent cases and chambering fresh rounds with mechanical precision. Each shot felt identical to the last, with the rifle returning to the same point of aim naturally. Earl completed his 10 shots with seconds to spare on the time limit. When the targets were examined, Earl's rapid-fire group was tighter than most competitors' carefully aimed, slow-fire groups. The 10 bullet holes could have been covered by a silver dollar, demonstrating accuracy that defied belief. Competition officials began measuring the group multiple times, unable to accept what their instruments were telling them about the old rifle's performance. The award ceremony drew a crowd larger than any previous regional competition. Earl stood on the winner's platform holding the Winchester, feeling overwhelmed by the attention and applause. The trophy he received was impressive, but he knew the real prize was discovering the treasure his grandfather had left him, hanging on the gun shop wall for so many years. Media interviews after the competition focused on Earl's plans for the future. Would he turn professional? Did he plan to compete nationally? Earl answered honestly that he just wanted to honor his grandfather's memory and enjoy shooting the remarkable rifle he had inherited. The fame and attention were nice, but they weren't what motivated him to pick up the Winchester. Other competitors approached Earl throughout the evening, asking to examine the rifle and requesting advice about equipment choices. Earl graciously allowed people to handle the Winchester, though he never let it out of his sight. Several offered to buy the rifle for substantial sums, but Earl politely declined every offer. The Winchester wasn't for sale at any price. Mike Patterson finally approached Earl near the end of the event, swallowing his pride to congratulate the man who had so thoroughly outshot him. Mike admitted that he had learned something important about focusing too much on equipment instead of fundamentals. Earl appreciated the gesture and invited Mike to join him at the local range for some friendly practice sessions with the Winchester. National shooting magazines picked up Earl's story within weeks of the regional competition. Photos of the old Winchester appeared on magazine covers alongside headlines about the antique rifle that was revolutionizing competitive shooting. Earl received calls from publishers wanting to write books about his experience and manufacturers, hoping to study the rifle's design characteristics. The Smithsonian Institution contacted Earl about borrowing the Winchester for a special exhibition on American firearms craftsmanship. Museum curators were fascinated by a rifle that had proven modern assumptions about antique weapons completely wrong. Earl was honored by the request but worried about letting the rifle travel so far from home, even for such a prestigious purpose. Gun manufacturers sent teams of engineers to examine the Winchester, hoping to discover design principles they could incorporate into modern rifles. Earl allowed these inspections, curious himself about what made his grandfather's rifle so special. The engineers found nothing unusual beyond exceptional build quality and attention to detail that was common in pre-war American firearms. A documentary film crew arrived in Earl's small town to create a feature about his story. They interviewed longtime residents who remembered Earl's grandfather and his reputation as an excellent shot. Several elderly men recalled that the grandfather had won numerous local shooting contests with the same Winchester, though those victories had been forgotten until Earl's recent success brought them back to light. The film crew discovered that Earl's grandfather had been a competitive shooter in his youth, winning state championships in the 1950s with the Winchester. Old newspaper clippings showed photos of a young man holding the same rifle Earl now carried, standing next to trophies that had long since been lost or forgotten. The rifle's accuracy wasn't a recent development, but a legacy that had been passed down through generations. Earl began receiving invitations to competitions across the country. Event organizers offered to pay his travel expenses and entry fees, viewing him as a guaranteed crowd draw. The story of the man with the antique rifle had captured public imagination, and ticket sales increased dramatically whenever Earl's participation was announced. He accepted selected invitations, choosing events that seemed fun rather than just prestigious. At his second major competition, Earl faced even stiffer competition from professional marksmen who had studied videos of his shooting technique. They came prepared with theories about how to defeat the Winchester's seemingly supernatural accuracy. Some brought historical rifles of their own, hoping to prove that other antique weapons could match Earl's performance. The results were the same as before. Earl and the Winchester dominated every stage of the competition, setting new accuracy records that officials thought might never be broken. The other historical rifles, while well-made, couldn't approach the Winchester's level of precision. Earl's weapon remained in a class by itself, continuing to mystify experts and competitors alike. Between competitions, Earl returned to his normal life running the gun shop and participating in local club activities. The Winchester went back to its place of honor on the wall, though now it was surrounded by trophies and newspaper clippings documenting its achievements. Customers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the famous rifle in person. Local shooting club membership tripled as people hoped to learn Earl's secrets or simply be around the legendary Winchester. Earl graciously shared his time and knowledge, though he honestly explained that he had no special techniques to teach. The rifle's performance remained as mysterious to him as it was to everyone else who witnessed it. A major ammunition manufacturer approached Earl about endorsing their products, offering a substantial contract for his promotional services. Earl declined the offer, explaining that the Winchester performed equally well with any quality ammunition. He didn't want to mislead people into thinking specific brands were responsible for his success when the rifle itself was clearly the key factor. Earl's story inspired other people to examine their own inherited firearms more carefully. Gun shops across the country reported increased interest in antique rifles as people hoped to discover their own hidden treasures. While no one found another Winchester quite like Earl's, many people developed new appreciation for the craftsmanship of earlier generations. The attention also brought Earl into contact with other descendants of skilled gunsmiths from the Winchester era. These families shared stories about their ancestors' work and the pride they took in creating rifles that would last for generations. Earl began to understand that his Winchester represented more than just exceptional accuracy. It was a piece of American manufacturing heritage. National shooting magazines picked up Earl's story within weeks of the regional competition. Photos of the old Winchester appeared on magazine covers alongside headlines about the antique rifle that was revolutionizing competitive shooting. Earl received calls from publishers wanting to write books about his experience and manufacturers, hoping to study the rifle's design characteristics. The Smithsonian Institution contacted Earl about borrowing the Winchester for a special exhibition on American firearms craftsmanship. Museum curators were fascinated by a rifle that had proven modern assumptions about antique weapons completely wrong. Earl was honored by the request but worried about letting the rifle travel so far from home, even for such a prestigious purpose. Gun manufacturers sent teams of engineers to examine the Winchester, hoping to discover design principles they could incorporate into modern rifles. Earl allowed these inspections, curious himself about what made his grandfather's rifle so special. The engineers found nothing unusual beyond exceptional build quality and attention to detail that was common in pre-war American firearms. A documentary film crew arrived in Earl's small town to create a feature about his story. They interviewed longtime residents who remembered Earl's grandfather and his reputation as an excellent shot. Several elderly men recalled that the grandfather had won numerous local shooting contests with the same Winchester, though those victories had been forgotten until Earl's recent success brought them back to light. The film crew discovered that Earl's grandfather had been a competitive shooter in his youth, winning state championships in the 1950s with the Winchester. Old newspaper clippings showed photos of a young man holding the same rifle Earl now carried, standing next to trophies that had long since been lost or forgotten. The rifle's accuracy wasn't a recent development, but a legacy that had been passed down through generations. Earl began receiving invitations to competitions across the country. Event organizers offered to pay his travel expenses and entry fees, viewing him as a guaranteed crowd draw. The story of the man with the antique rifle had captured public imagination, and ticket sales increased dramatically whenever Earl's participation was announced. He accepted selected invitations, choosing events that seemed fun rather than just prestigious. At his second major competition, Earl faced even stiffer competition from professional marksmen who had studied videos of his shooting technique. They came prepared with theories about how to defeat the Winchester's seemingly supernatural accuracy. Some brought historical rifles of their own, hoping to prove that other antique weapons could match Earl's performance. The results were the same as before. Earl and the Winchester dominated every stage of the competition, setting new accuracy records that officials thought might never be broken. The other historical rifles, while well-made, couldn't approach the Winchester's level of precision. Earl's weapon remained in a class by itself, continuing to mystify experts and competitors alike. Between competitions, Earl returned to his normal life running the gun shop and participating in local club activities. The Winchester went back to its place of honor on the wall, though now it was surrounded by trophies and newspaper clippings documenting its achievements. Customers came from hundreds of miles away just to see the famous rifle in person. Local shooting club membership tripled as people hoped to learn Earl's secrets or simply be around the legendary Winchester. Earl graciously shared his time and knowledge, though he honestly explained that he had no special techniques to teach. The rifle's performance remained as mysterious to him as it was to everyone else who witnessed it. A major ammunition manufacturer approached Earl about endorsing their products, offering a substantial contract for his promotional services. Earl declined the offer, explaining that the Winchester performed equally well with any quality ammunition. He didn't want to mislead people into thinking specific brands were responsible for his success when the rifle itself was clearly the key factor. Earl's story inspired other people to examine their own inherited firearms more carefully. Gun shops across the country reported increased interest in antique rifles as people hoped to discover their own hidden treasures. While no one found another Winchester quite like Earl's, many people developed new appreciation for the craftsmanship of earlier generations. The attention also brought Earl into contact with other descendants of skilled gunsmiths from the Winchester era. These families shared stories about their ancestors' work and the pride they took in creating rifles that would last for generations. Earl began to understand that his Winchester represented more than just exceptional accuracy. It was a piece of American manufacturing heritage. The victory celebration was unlike anything Earl had ever experienced. Flag ceremonies, medal presentations, and interviews with international media created a whirlwind that left him feeling overwhelmed but grateful. The Winchester sat beside him during every interview, its simple wooden stock and iron sights drawing amazed looks from reporters who still couldn't believe such an ordinary-looking rifle had dominated the world's most advanced shooting. Equipment Klaus Weber approached Earl after the ceremony, requesting to examine the Winchester one final time. The German champion handled the rifle with reverence, understanding that he had been defeated by something truly special. Klaus admitted that in 30 years of competitive shooting, he had never encountered anything that challenged his understanding of marksmanship as completely as Earl's antique Winchester. The flight home was filled with reflection, for Earl. He thought about his grandfather, who had somehow known this rifle was extraordinary, even when nobody else believed it. The old man's stories hadn't been exaggerated memories after all. They had been accurate accounts of a truly remarkable weapon. Earl felt a deep connection to his grandfather through the Winchester that transcended simple inheritance. Back home, the gun shop became a pilgrimage destination for shooting enthusiasts from around the world. People traveled thousands of miles just to see the Winchester and meet the man who had proven that craftsmanship could triumph over technology. Earl welcomed visitors graciously, though he never charged admission or tried to profit from his fame beyond the normal business it brought to his shop. Museums from multiple countries renewed their requests to display the Winchester, offering increasingly generous terms for temporary exhibitions. Earl finally agreed to a limited tour, but only on condition that he would personally accompany the rifle to every venue. He had learned that the Winchester's magic seemed to work only when they were together. The exhibitions drew record crowds wherever they appeared. People lined up for hours to see the rifle that had redefined their understanding of firearms capabilities. Children who had never shown interest in shooting sports became fascinated by the story of the antique rifle that refused to accept its supposed limitations. Earl began receiving letters from all over the world, many from elderly people who shared stories about their own inherited rifles and family treasures they had never properly appreciated. His story had inspired people to look more carefully at items they had dismissed as outdated or worthless. Several correspondents discovered their own family heirlooms had remarkable qualities that had been forgotten over time. The Winchester Company, which still existed as part of a larger corporation, invited Earl to their headquarters for a special ceremony, honoring the rifle that bore their name so proudly. Company historians examined Earl's Winchester and confirmed it was indeed a standard production model from their golden era, with no special modifications or custom features that would explain its extraordinary performance. As years passed, Earl continued competing occasionally, though he was more selective about events. The Winchester never failed to perform, maintaining its supernatural accuracy regardless of conditions or competition level. Earl began to understand that some things in life couldn't be explained by science or logic. They simply had to be experienced and appreciated. The local shooting club where Earl's journey began erected a small monument commemorating the day when an underestimated antique rifle first proved its worth. The inscription read simply, "Sometimes the old ways are still the best ways." Earl felt this captured the essence of what he had learned from his grandfather's Winchester. Earl eventually wrote a book about his experiences, not to make money but to preserve the story for future generations. The book became a bestseller, inspiring countless people to reconsider their assumptions about age, technology, and the value of craftsmanship. Earl donated most of the proceeds to youth shooting programs, hoping to introduce young people to the sport that had changed his life. In quiet moments at the gun shop, Earl would often take down the Winchester and hold it, feeling the smooth wood and cool metal that had made him famous. He never forgot that the rifle had chosen him as much as he had chosen it. The weapon remained a mystery, but Earl had learned that some mysteries were meant to be cherished rather than solved. The Winchester still hangs on the wall of Earl's gun shop today, surrounded by trophies and photographs that document its incredible journey, from forgotten relic to world champion. Visitors still come to see it, and Earl still shares its story with anyone who wants to listen. He always ends by reminding people that sometimes the most extraordinary things come in the most ordinary packages, and that dismissing something because of its age might mean missing out on true greatness.